Live on BBC Two.
It's Thursday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster.
Do not surrender to their tax riser. Do not surrender your local council and our finances to them.
They've been in power for 14 years. Who's the guy in charge of the system over the last 14 years?
The final head-to-head showdown before Election Day in a week's time. What did we learn?
What do we want?
Pay restoration.
When do we want it?
Now!
Junior doctors begin another 5-day strike. Can any party resolve it?
Alors, trois blocs politiques sont aujourd'hui en position d'obtenir une majorité à l'Assemblée nationale.
And there's also an election going on in France. What could it mean for us? Joining us today, Business Minister Kevin Hollinrake, Shadow Science Secretary Peter Kyle, Ava Santina Evans from the Politics Joe website and Emma Revel from the Centre for Policy Studies. This is Politics Live Election 2024. Welcome to viewers on BBC Two, BBC iPlayer and BBC News. Well, let's start with the BBC News headline. The 11th strike of junior doctor pay dispute begins. Yes, they have walked out again for 5 days, as we can see here, over pay restoration. It comes, this strike, on the hottest week of the year. Warnings from the head of NHS England, Amanda Pritchard, and leading health officials about the pressures on hospitals. Now, the timing has been criticised by both the Health Secretary and NHS bosses, who say in the middle of an election campaign, no party is in a position to negotiate. My opening question to all of you is, if Keir Starmer, starting with you, Kevin, if Keir Starmer has ruled out meeting a 35% pay restoration demand by junior doctors, would a change of government resolve anything?
Well, I don't know. I had no idea at what level Keir Starmer would settle this dispute. We've been clear. We've already raised salaries for junior doctors by 9% this year. I think there was negotiation about another 3% on top of that. I think there's a fair figures. We've settled the nurses dispute and the specialist consultants at fair figures. 35%, is that fair to the taxpayer? I don't believe it is. I keep hearing from Labour, we should have settled this by now. At what level, at what cost to the taxpayer?
Would a change of government make any difference, Peter Carr, if Keir Starmer and Labour have ruled out the demand, the key demand, restoration over time? What difference would it make?
Well, I hope we get to find out, because what we do know is if you get more of the same, if no change, it will carry on exactly as it has been. The biggest period of industrial action, industrial strife since the 1970s has been under this government. Now, don't forget, this started out, this whole series of industrial action, with Grant Shapps as Transport Secretary refusing to meet with the unions for 6 months, simply because he thought it would be difficult for Labour. So a lot of the seeds of what we're suffering now has been sowed by this government. They're picking up the pieces for it. Wes Streeting has said that he will pick up the phone straight away if he becomes Health Secretary. He will start that process. And, of course, he's willing to talk about some of the broader areas impacting the doctor's experience and the NHS, because terms and conditions and pay all need to be on the table. Doesn't mean you're going to be soft, you're going to be a tough set of negotiations, but go into that room with an open mind. Every successful negotiation has been done by that. It's about statecraft, diligence and graft.
And money.
None of which...
And money.
Well, all of these things are on the table. When you've got the statecraft, if you've got the diligence, the graft, you can get into negotiations and come out with a good deal for taxpayers and a good deal for patients and the workers too.
I'm not sure the junior doctors, given that claim at 35%, are interested in statecraft. Well, I think they're interested in more money, as you said. And what Peter needs to do, and what Streeting needs to say, is where that money's coming from. At what level would you have settled it? And where is that money coming from? Because it's only come from one place, which is from the taxpayer.
Well, let's have a look at this headline in The Times, Ava and Emma. Striking doctors confident Labour is listening to pay demands. Do you think a change of government might end these strikes?
That's interesting, because that's not the impression that I got from the striking doctors that I visited on the picket lines this morning. They were actually rather nervous about it. And, you know, Labour actually do pose quite a risk to the current, to doctors actually fleeing the NHS and moving to Australia, because if they are going to use private healthcare to smash through these waiting lists, well, you know, that's going to cost an awful lot of money, and it's going to take a lot of doctors, you know, out of service. It's actually going to put a real strain on the day-to-day for doctors, and they're really concerned about it. You know, Wes Streeting says that he will meet with them, and he says that he will be, you know, he'll be ready to negotiate, but he's also said he's not going to meet the 35% pay demand, and actually that really is their threshold. I don't think if you're meeting that, they're not going to they're not going to come to resolution.
Interesting. Peter, do you want to respond?
Well, I mean, every negotiation is give and take, and unions know that more than any others. And when you look at how some of the other disputes have been settled, even the nurses gave way as well, because that's how negotiations go. In terms of getting around the table and doing this, and also use of the private sector, we're talking about using existing capacity in the private sector in order to lessen the burden that's already on NHS doctors. The reason why so many of them are fleeing is because the NHS is broken, the experience of working in it is overstretched, understaffed and undersupported.
They're angry at you because they know that the private sector is already being used and the agencies are already being used. So they're angry because they're saying, well, you're not listening to us because actually there's no capacity to tap into.
What we're going to do is fix the NHS and get it back so it's fit for the doctors that are in there at the moment. We're not saying we're going to permanently... We're tackling the crisis by using all of the capacity that our country has right now to get the NHS fixed and facing the future again.
All right.
We're not talking about having a new norm.
Well, hang on. It's a week away from polling day. We can see Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, there out campaigning in Derbyshire after the debate, the head-to-head debate last night. We'll be speaking to our correspondent who is following him today. But, Emma, what do you think of that headline? Striking doctors confident Labour is listening to pay demands, despite the fact that Keir Starmer and Wes Streeting have both ruled out, if they were to be in government, ruled out that 35% pay restoration.
Well, I don't think anyone, even the junior doctors, really expect 35%. Anyone knows if you go into negotiation and say, this is what I want, you know that that's not what you're going to get. It would be an astonishing negotiation if you got what you asked for immediately. So, you know, you have to accept that Labour is listening, and Wes Streeting has said he's going to get round the table. They don't expect to actually get 35% in reality. But I think Labour has to settle this, because what is the alternative? 5 more years of junior doctor strikes? You know, the NHS salary bill overall is 71.5 billion. It's about 46% of the total NHS budget. And the current government's NHS workforce plan says that we expect over the next 15 years to have another 1 million people working within the NHS, such as the demand on the health service from, you know, an ageing population, among other things. So we have to be honest about the costs of the salary, and that means that, unfortunately, 35% isn't going to happen. But Labour does have to, I think, bring this to a resolution soon to prove that they were credible.
Right. Well, the last big set piece event, if you like, of the election campaign between Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer took place last night, hosted by the BBC and my colleague Michelle Hussein, all before. You can see them here just ahead of the debate actually starting. The two main party leaders clashed over immigration, small boats and taxation. Now, before we get to the substance of the sort of policy debate, let's have a look at some of the front pages and their verdict. The Daily Telegraph. Sunak's plea to voters, don't surrender Britain to Labour. That was very much his message throughout the debate last night. The Guardian has this headline. Prime Minister and Starmer clash over betting scandal in tetchy final TV debate. And finally, The Times. Sunak rams home tax message in final debate. Ava, what was your main takeaway?
I mean, it was probably the strongest that we've seen Rishi Sunak. I actually thought that Keir Starmer didn't seem to be expecting it. At the debate last week that we went to, I actually felt like Starmer had walked in as if he was the man, and Sunak looked terrified, and there was a little bit of a flip there. But look, you know, I think that this gambling scandal, as it has made the front pages today, I think this is going to be probably one of the most important issues as we head into the ballot box. Yeah, I don't like the moral panic over gambling, but I do think that it ties into a sequence of events. It's Partygate, it's drinking on the job in Parliament, and it's gambling, and it's sex scandals. This is what voters are thinking about and talking about.
We'll talk about it in just a moment when we catch up with the individual campaigns. Your main takeaway from last night?
Well, I think he was right. Sunak seemed a lot more confident, and I think there'll be a lot of Conservative activists and candidates and campaigners up and down the country thinking, well, where was this guy 6 weeks ago? We could have done with him, you know, the whole time putting forward a more confident, a more aggressive, you know, defence of his policies. I think, though, if anyone chose to watch the football instead, that was probably the right decision. I think the public think this is dragging on, and what really do you learn about a series of head-to-head debates that you don't learn from the first one? You know, new issues come up, like the betting scandal, for example, but I think the public generally, you know, are sort of thinking, well, Sunak was more confident, Starmer seemed a little bit more nervous, but in terms of messaging, nothing's really changed.
Well, except, of course, there are a lot of people who've still to make up their minds, as in every election. But one of the most heated exchanges, if you were watching last night, was over the issue of small boat crossings. Now, the UK government wants to send some asylum seekers, as you'll know, unless you've been living under a rock, to Rwanda to deter people from crossing the English Channel in those boats. Rishi Sunak says if he wins the general election, the first flights for Rwanda will leave later on in July. Sir Keir Starmer has pledged to scrap the Rwanda scheme before it gets off the ground if Labour wins, and would instead use counter-terrorism powers to stop gangs smuggling people across the Channel. Let's get a flavour of that debate.
The Prime Minister says he'll send them all to Rwanda. The Rwanda scheme takes a few hundred. It would take literally 300 years to get all the people who are here unlawfully to Rwanda. So they're going to stay here.
If elected, what would you do?
What would you do with them? So at the moment, they're not being processed. So they're sitting in hotels, which you are all paying for. They're not processed, and as a result of not being processed, that means not a single one, even those that shouldn't be here, can be returned anywhere.
Well, do you know where these people come from?
No, he's not answering the question.
Do you know where they
can
come from? Iran,
You can see.
Syria, Afghanistan. So when Keir Starmer says he's going to return people, is he going to sit down? Are you going to sit down with the Iranian ayatollahs? Are you going to try and do a deal with the Taliban? It's completely nonsensical what you are saying, right? You are taking people for fools, right? I think that these people should not stay in our country. They will be on planes to Rwanda. That's what I will do with them.
Kevin, the problem is no flights to Rwanda have taken off, or none on this scheme. Well, you say that, but for all the talk, no one has actually gone to Rwanda.
Well, that's because Peter and his colleagues and Keir Starmer resisted our legislation for months, 130 times.
Kevin,
the Rwanda legislation isn't just about Rwanda. What also happens now, as part of that legislation, when there's people come across the channel, and Keir Starmer does not understand this, he fails to acknowledge it, those people don't go into hotels now, they go into detention. That is the key point here. That is a deterrent in itself. Now, as soon as Keir Starmer takes over, if he takes over, he's going to scrap this legislation. All those people will leave detention and end up on our streets.
Can I just make a couple of points? One, you came into this Parliament with a majority of 80, and you're blaming Labour for delaying a bill going through Parliament.
Yes, I do blame you for that.
And secondly, the reason why your bill was delayed was because how many of your MPs voted against your legislation?
A handful compared to the number of you. How many?
16 voted against, and 12 voted against, and 16 abstained. The problem was not Labour holding it up.
Nonsense.
You've got a massive majority, and you've got people on your own side who are trying to delay this legislation.
Did you vote against it 130 times or not? Did you vote against it 130 times?
We said that it was unworkable, it was unpractical, and it wouldn't work.
So you don't think it's
and
right
it hasn't.
But how do you know?
Because it hasn't. We predicted that this bill would not lead to flights taking off or a deterrent. Flights have not taken off. Yeah. There is no deterrent because we've just had the highest several months of.
And Peter's right. Peter's right. It's not a deterrent.
The legislation is not working. So, a border security command. Let's stop the boats coming over in the first place. Let's give terror powers. Because why is it the BBC can go over and find these people smugglers? They can go and talk to them. But our police force can't. We don't have a border security command that can go over there, use terror legislation. It is the BBC that is tracking down these people, but this British government, with its intelligence and its border force security, is not. They don't have the powers, they don't have the resources, because they're all focused in things that fail.
What is your response, though, to Peter saying it isn't acting as a deterrent? Because we've talked about Rwanda endlessly in terms of deporting people who come here to have their applications processed there, and yet he's right. Record number of people have crossed the Channel in 2024, certainly above the numbers for the same period last year. It's not even working as a deterrent before the flights take off.
That's wrong. It's working right now. The Prime Minister quoted last night. He quoted last night from people over in Calais who was saying that this is a deterrent, that this is that they are.
But the numbers don't back it up.
I'll come to that. Concerned about, and we've also read the reports about people going to Ireland rather than come to the UK. It's a deterrent already. The reason it's not a bigger deterrent right now is they think this lot are going to get into power and open the doors wide, throw the doors wide open. That is the problem. If we got into power, we'll get Rwanda working. We've got detention working. They will not come. There's the deterrent in effect.
It's difficult to come back on that, isn't it? I mean, people aren't sitting in Calais in camps and in tents talking about a potential Keir Starmer government and then making their way across the Channel.
Yes, they are.
come on, Kevin.
They're all looking at the latest MRP poll, are they?
Well, anyway, so I went down to Wethersfield, actually, a couple of weeks ago, which is one of the large, you actually call it a holding centre, but it is a detention centre, for want of better language. And the people who are there are hundreds of men who haven't been processed yet, and they actually are free to walk across the villages there. So when you're making this argument that Keir Starmer is going to get into government and then suddenly there's going to be a lot of asylum seekers walking across the country, that is already happening. There are already people who are firstly suffering, waiting for their claims to be processed, but also free to walk around. So you can't make the argument that you're sort of in the purveyor of law and order, and then when it comes to Keir Starmer, there's going to be thousands, hundreds of thousands of migrants walking around the country.
Emma?
Of course, being in detention is a deterrent. Of course it is. Going to Rwanda is a deterrent. That's the change in this legislation. It's only just been affected, the legislation, because of the delays forced upon us by the opposition. That is a undeniable fact.
No, that's not true. You know that's not true. And you've got people at the moment who are suffering catastrophic mental health issues in these detention centres waiting to be processed, and you're just leaving them there.
Of course we want to process those people more quickly, but we want to deter them in the first place from coming in the first place.
There's 36,000 asylum seekers. There are 36,000 in hotels right now, unprocessed.
Just before I come to Emma, you say there's 36,000 people waiting to be processed, but what is Labour's answer to Rishi Sunak's question? And actually it was put to Keir Starmer in another debate about returns, about people who come here from Iran, Syria and Afghanistan. How would it work?
Well, the first thing is, and this is really interesting, because the whole premise of the debate so far and all the subjects has been what will Labour do to tackle this problem caused by the previous government? And there's an assumption, of course, that Labour's going to be in the position to do it. And let me just tell people, there is no Labour government unless people get out there and vote for it. So change can't happen unless people vote for it.
And the answer to the question?
And the answer is that Rishi Sunak's question, based on how will you fix the problem that he created, is he shouldn't have...
Well, hang on. I'm not sure he created it exactly, but can you answer the question about where will those migrants go back to if you don't have a returns agreement with, as Rishi Sunak said, the Ayatollahs in Iran, the Taliban in Afghanistan and Bashar al-Assad's government in Syria?
The first thing we will do is stop the small boats. In fact, we will take action against the small boats.
But what will you do with those?
I realise. Then we will start the process of what this government has not done, is start processing them. We don't know, because there are 36,000 people in hotels, £8 million a day, have not been processed. You're not even starting the process of getting these people processed. So we don't know yet where they are from, who has the right to be here, who needs to be deported. And until we know these answers, how can we start answering the questions specifically that you're asking? We don't know how many people need to be returned to some of these countries, but we will get in place plans for returns agreements. We will start working with the EU colleagues. We will not do free movement.
As I say, we don't quite know how the returns will work.
But we will start to layer on the agreements.
Let me just ask Emma, the overarching question, paraphrasing from last night, but it's been a theme throughout the debate, is why can't any government protect the borders? I mean, I'm not asking you why, but it's interesting. Do you listen to the two politicians here and think that will ever be answered?
I think there are lots of measures that can be introduced to try and stop channel crossings. I think the idea that, either Keir Starmer's plan or Rishi Sunak's is working as a deterrent is it's clearly untrue. We had record numbers. We're tracking above 2022, which is the record year for arrivals already. And I think one of the reasons that Rishi Sunak probably wanted to have the election now is not have a summer of good weather where people were arriving in record numbers every single day. I think, as well, when people are concerned about immigration, they do differentiate between legal and illegal, because Rishi Sunak and the Conservative Party have really played into stopping the boats, not just in the election campaign, but for many, many months and years prior to this. But actually, legal migration is dwarfing illegal migration. And if you are a voter who's concerned about pressure on, GP places, school places, infrastructure, housing, legal migration is actually where you need to be focused, because the numbers are almost 10 times as well.
All right, well,
just find that the question you put was what are the solutions? Are there still other solutions? Look at the Labour solution. We're going to smash the gangs. It is nonsensical. You play whack-a-mole for decades. We've done it with the drug gangs. Of course we closed down gangs. We've closed down 82 already. But your strategy is going to be simply about saying to people, I'm going to arrest you, often in foreign countries, often in places like Iran or other places. It's not practical, Peter. I'm sorry, it is not practical. You need
yours is a counsel of despair, then. Your thing is nobody can tackle this.
Everybody's willing to listen to it, but you need a deterrent. This is a deterrent. It will work.
Let's talk about taxation, because Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer also clashed over this issue, but specifically whether or not Labour will bring in what Rishi Sunak calls a retirement tax. Let's have a listen.
The position on pensioners and tax, or pensions on tax, that we've set out is exactly the same. It is the position of the government at their last budget. It is their position. The Prime Minister now says, oh, I'm going to change that. I'm going to change all that. When asked where the money is coming from, his Chancellor says the money is being spent, it isn't there. That is making the same mistake again. Can I just address the IFS point, though, because I think that is really important.
If you're a pensioner, you should know there is a retirement tax coming for you, capital R, capital T, if he is your Prime Minister.
He can promise
for the first time in our
20
country's
tax
history,
cuts. He can't
pensioners
tell us how
are going to
he's
be paying tax because he won't match our triple lock plus. If I'm your Prime Minister, that won't happen, and that's what I'll deliver for you. As I say it again, do not surrender your finances to their tax rises.
Kevin, the triple lock plus policy, which raises the personal allowance for pensioners by 2027, it would only save someone living solely on the state pension around £29 a year.
Today, as the pension increases, of course, but as our commitment is to do that long term. So the higher the triple
because you're going to keep, if you win the election, you're going to keep frozen tax thresholds, are you, beyond 2028?
Well, let's see. I can't say we would definitely do that, but that's a commitment thus far, and it's important. We do raise tax to pay back some of the COVID debt we accumulated. But in terms of pensioners, and I hear this on the doorstep a lot, people do not want to see that state pension tax. We've committed to make sure that they do not get it taxed.
If they don't want to see it taxed, why don't you unfreeze the tax thresholds? You're introducing a policy to offset another policy. So you're introducing a triple lock plus, as you call it, to offset your policy of freezing tax thresholds, which have led to more pensioners and others being dragged into paying tax.
Yes. Because you cannot accumulate, you cannot spend £500 billion of taxpayers' money helping people through the COVID crisis. Prediction of 600,000 businesses would have gone bust. Millions of jobs have been lost had we not done that. You cannot spend that kind of taxpayers' money without getting it back. Now, what we've tried to do is get it back in the most progressive way possible. This is the most progressive way to do it. The average earner in this country now pays record lows of tax as a percentage, as a marginal rate, record in the last 50 years, because we're trying to make sure...
but the overall tax...
on low income.
The thing is, it's got to be set against the bigger overall tax burden. You know, I'm sure viewers will hear what you've just said, but actually, the sort of honest response, Peter, is that if Labour win the government on the basis of what some have called a trap for Labour, pensioners will pay more tax.
More tax that this government has introduced. And this is the thing...
But you're going to continue with the tax thresholds too.
There is no greater example of why the country is so desperate for change than the sight of a Prime Minister standing up and hysterically screaming and a Treasury Minister or Business Minister coming into this TV studios and campaigning against a policy that they introduced in the last year, as if, you know, this was a Labour policy. Now, what we've done is been really, really sensible and serious. You're campaigning against your own policy. You're saying you're going to scrap it on the other side and challenging us to say whether we'll scrap it too. What the Labour Party has done all the way through this campaign is been really upfront about the challenges, the depth of those challenges that the country will face if a Labour government comes in.
And pensioners will pay more tax without this triple lock plus.
Therefore, we are doing everything possible to stabilise the economy, then invest in the economy and reform the economy.
Yeah,
but we have to be serious.
I've just said to Kevin that this is a policy to offset another policy. So the more pensioners are being dragged into paying income tax or tax on whatever income, whether they're on the state pension or whether they have the state pension and other income. But the honest response from Labour is to say, rightly or wrongly, we're not going to have a triple lock plus, so pensioners will pay more tax. A bit more, maybe a lot more.
But Jo, we've been very honest about this.
Right, so yes.
We have been honest. Yeah. We are not accepting this uncosted, unfunded promise by the Tory party. What we are doing is focusing on the economy overall. We're going to get growth into it. But who's going to benefit most? Those people on lower incomes and people living later in life whose utility bills per household will fall by up to £350 over the course of a parliament. That's just one example of how Labour is getting a grip on the economy and making sure those people who need it the most benefit. This is what we're already doing. Issues specifically to do with the pensions going forward will be the responsibility of the Chancellor. And once we get the growth back into the economy after so many years of stagnant growth, no growth or negative growth,
let me bring in Emma.
we will be able to invest more into our public services.
Listening to this, there has been, as the Institute for Fiscal Studies likes to say, a conspiracy of silence over the sort of big tax and spend. But how important is this discussion over tax when it comes to pensioners?
Well, not just pensioners. Tax and spend is, incredibly important for everyone.
Yes, but specifically on this triple lock plus.
It makes sense from a Conservative Party perspective to promise something for pensioners because if you look at what is likely to be the average age of a Conservative voter in this election, it's going to be, approaching pension age, if not actually hitting it, in some worst-case scenario predictions. What we're not talking about is the fact that what is termed, I don't like the term, but geriatric spending on older people across the government as a whole, so not just pensions, but pensions, social care, age-related healthcare, is roughly about 10% of our GDP. To maintain that over the next 50 years, we need to grow the economy by 2.9% every single year. Over the last 20 years, the economy has grown by 2.9% twice, and one of those was the COVID rebound. So actually, we need to be having a much bigger conversation about how we afford all state spending, not just this one particular measure.
Is it a trap for Labour?
Well, I think... Look, where to begin with this? I'm sort of tired about talking about pensioners. I think it's so obvious that no one should be taxing the state pension. It's so blindingly obvious. I think the conversation that we're having around capital gains is also ridiculous. You've got to recoup the money somewhere. Someone like the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, who has a large amount of, he could actually be taxed a lot if you increase the capital gains tax. That would be a pretty good way to recoup money rather than going after old people. I'm also tired of not talking about the under 35s, who on top of already an increasing tax burden also have to pay their student loan repayments, which actually comes out as a tax. And it is a lot of money. You've got young people who are earning probably about £30,000 and they're paying a high rate of tax. They're paying the equivalent of what people on £80,000 are earning. And, it's great to talk about pensioners. I know that they're your main cohort for voters. But for goodness sake, you've got a lot of under 35s. It'd be great to talk about them at some point.
We will. But before we do, let's get out on the campaign and catch up with my colleague Damien Grammaticus, who is with Labour today. What's going on?
Well, yeah, interesting what you're talking about there just now, talking about young people, pensioners, tax, economy, because so we've been with Sir Keir Starmer, we're back on the bus, he's just got on, so we're in the West Midlands, he's just been at a college talking to students here, Labour focusing on that today, but the questions he got, that was interesting because that's what ties in with just what you were talking about. So those questions were about student loans, about university finance, that universities are desperately in need of money, students saddled with debt, students worried about housing, students worried about things like benefits, personal independence payments. One student was on, asked Sir Keir Starmer about that, and he gave the usual answers. He said they have to make tough decisions, so therefore he's had to, on tuition fees, he's had to prioritise the NHS, much as he would like to address that. On the questions of college funding and things, he sort of pivoted that to talking about, well, if you can help colleges with their energy bills, then their costs come down and they can help students. That's not really a direct answer. That's, I think, part of the issue you're hearing about there is the problems the parties have addressing this. And actually that one student who talked to him about the PIP payments, I went to ask her at the end and said, what did you think? And she said, well, she's still worried because she feels very concerned about her future, trying to get into work, but worried about sanctions that she might face in future.
Right, interesting. Just very briefly, the mood today in the Labour camp?
Yes, interesting. So in the press huddle, after the event, Keir Starmer comes over and everyone gets a chance to put a few quick questions to him. And he was asked very directly about last night's debate. How did he think it went? His answer was pretty good, was his assessment. And you'd expect him to say that. But the sort of message he wanted, the takeaway he wanted from that was that he felt that he was putting a positive case and that Rishi Sunak was running a much more negative campaign. He was saying that's the position he wants to be in as the Labour leader going into the last week of the campaign. and putting a case for change. And so he feels relatively comfortable with that. Of course, he did say, and it was put to him, well, you face some pretty tough questions. And he said, well, he welcomes that because he thinks that's part of the sort of cut and thrust of things.
All right.
That's at least the sort of spin they want to put on it. And interestingly, that's kind of the core message I think you're going to hone in on today and in the next few days. And the sort of final run-in is that question about, this message about, this is about change, is what Labour will say. This is about getting out and voting and making a difference, and wanting to say that, they want to push be seen to be having a positive message, not a defensive one.
Damien Grammaticas there on one of the Labour buses heading off. Let's catch up with Helen Catt, who is with Rishi Sunak and the Conservative campaign somewhere in Derbyshire. Helen, hello to you. What's been the mood there?
So the mood this morning has been pretty buoyant among the Conservatives as they came out on this visit. We're at a manufacturer in Derbyshire. Work has started again, so you might hear a bit of banging in a second. But Rishi Sunak has been doing a Q&A with staff here, and I think there's a couple of things which were really interesting to take from it. So firstly, I think this is one of the more challenging Q&As that I have seen happen in this sort of scenario. The very first question to Rishi Sunak was about how after 14 years of government being asked for another Conservative term, when the lady who asked it, Anne, said that everything was worse than it had been in 2010 and asked him about food bank usage. She was also asked about fixing the NHS, and the person who asked that came up with a follow-up, well, are you going to stop treating people in corridors? And the last question came from a group, actually a lady who is part of a group that the Conservatives have been targeting very hard in this election, pensioners. But Margaret was a working pensioner, and she was asking Rishi Sunak why she still had to pay tax on her earnings. Now, he talked about the Conservatives' policy on the state pension, making sure that people wouldn't have to pay a tax on their state pension, but he didn't really have an answer for that part of her question about having to be taxed on her earnings despite having paid in for so long. So it's quite interesting to see that. And the second thing I'd take from it is that he was very clearly in his speech here doubling down on the approach that he took in the TV debate last night, which seemed to serve him well there, very much attacking Labour, Sir Keir Starmer for saying, he's not telling you what he's going to do, talking about him going to whack up taxes. Now, that seemed to work pretty well for him in the debate last night. It may not have worked so well for him in this kind of forum. Speaking to some of the people here afterwards, they were saying to me, well, look, hang on, he's come here to talk to us. I didn't want to know what he says Labour's not going to do. I wanted to know what he's going to do for us. So it's interesting to see that strategy, which looks like the Conservatives are going to be hammering home until polling day, coming into direct contact with voters here, and maybe it not playing perhaps as well as it seemed to last night.
Well, that is also interesting in terms of the approach by Rishi Sunak and the Conservatives, depending on the audience of people they are talking to and the forum, as you say. You have an update, Helen, for us on the ongoing gambling investigation. What is it?
Yeah, we've had an update from the Metropolitan Police this morning to say that they have reviewed the names of people who placed bets on the date of the election, on the election timing, against a list of their officers. And they have identified 7 officers. That includes the one officer who was arrested on suspicion of misconduct in public office. And they also say that the Gambling Commission, that they are going to look at some cases. So they're saying that the Gambling Commission is going to keep taking the lead in the vast majority of cases that are being looked at. Anything that falls squarely within the Gambling Act will be run by the Gambling Commission. But the Metropolitan Police has said there will be a small number of cases where, as they put it, a broader criminal investigation by the police is required. The understanding on that is that that is where it strays beyond just the Gambling Act and may take in other offences too.
Helen Catt, thank you very much there with the Conservative campaign and Rishi Sunak. Kevin, can I start with you? Because your colleague, Conservative Philip Davis, has reportedly put £8,000 on him losing his seat at the election. We can see it here, the BBC News story. Tory MP candidate bet £8,000 he would lose seat. Now, you have put yourself a bet on the election outcome nationally some time ago, but you said that betting on yourself would be wrong. So does that mean Philip Davis is wrong for his alleged bet?
Well, you said reportedly. I don't know about the details behind Philip, and he should have the chance to answer any accusations against him. The Prime Minister has been very clear. If people have broken the rules, they'll be kicked out of the Conservative Party. That is very clear. That's our position, and Philip will be subject to that like anybody else.
Sure, but if he had put a bet against himself, you still agree and still think what you said in that interview on Times Radio, that it would be wrong?
Well, I mean, it may not have broken the rules, but it does sound to me, if somebody does something that they've got direct influence over, then that I do think there are concerns around that.
Right. I mean, Labour have taken action against a candidate, again, too quickly in terms of finding out whether or not any rules have been broken.
No, this is the kind of decisive nature of Keir. You know, if somebody is under investigation, join an election, but also a public servant, and it is possible that they have committed an offence of this nature, then they shouldn't be representing our party, particularly at this particular moment in time. Kevin said it's perfectly clear, but it certainly wasn't for 2 weeks. 1/3 of an entire election campaign was spent trying to answer what on earth the Prime Minister was trying to do, how it takes him so long to make a decision, how he displays his weakness so profoundly in the middle of a general election campaign is quite beyond me.
Why didn't Keir Starmer suspend Angela Rayner when she was being investigated by the police about whether she paid capital gains tax or not?
She said she didn't do it. These are people who demonstrably have something to answer.
No, you said an investigation. You said if somebody was under investigation, they should be suspended.
Have something to answer. Back
well,
then,
presumably there was some evidence, so the police wouldn't investigate.
Well, Kevin, except it was at the time a Conservative MP, no longer, because you're all candidates, who actually called certainly for the second part of that investigation, as you call it. But let me go back to something.
Investigate willy-nilly. They investigate based on evidence.
Well, in fact, he was sitting, James Daly, in your seat. He couldn't tell me what it was that he thought was worth investigating when I asked him at the time. You said you don't like the moral panic around that. Is that how the sort of Labour Party's response, is that how it looks?
Well, I think...
Because lots of people clearly place bets, I mean, legitimately on things like election contests.
And in isolation, it wouldn't be a problem if you were, putting a bet on. The problem is this culture of sleaze and this culture of not seeming to take the job very seriously. I think what's unfortunate is that the last 14 years of, well, actually probably the last 3 years of Conservatives have led to there being, we're going to have a written constitution because no one can seem to behave themselves. Like if you're not drinking in Downing Street during COVID,
really damaging,
if you're not
really damaging to the world of politics, and people need to have faith in democracy. The vast majority of people on Peter's side of the political fence or mine go into politics for the right reasons. This is not everybody. It is a small minority of people. We should keep in that context.
It's a lot of you.
It's a small minority.
We cannot underestimate how damaging Partygate was.
I agree.
Not just for the Conservatives, but for government at large, for politics at large.
I understand
and then
that.
you time that with the number of sexual assault allegations or sexual harassment allegations. You also, the gambling scandal. I can go on and on and on.
Yes, and you'll still come to a small number of people. Politics has its faults, but the vast majority of people go into politics across the spectrum for the right reasons and doing a decent job. If we make out that every politician's on the take, self-serving, incompetent, then those are the only people who ever stand for politics. It's completely wrong.
But your party's done nothing to reverse those allegations.
But also, it's enforcing the rules that are there. The ministerial code is a good code. Priti Patel broke it. The Prime Minister didn't put any sanctions on her at all for it. So when you actually have, the Home Secretary of the day breaking the ministerial code, having no sanctions whatsoever, not even a public reprimand, then that's when the codes, the rules that already exist, get swept aside. And that's when standards crash through the floor. This is one of the challenges that we will have if we win, if people do choose change.
Well, let's talk about the French elections in the final minutes of the programme, because President Macron of France astounded the country by calling a snap election in reaction to his defeat by the far right at the elections to the European Parliament. And the first round of those snap parliamentary elections is on Sunday, the second on July the 7th. Let's join Sophie Pedder, Paris bureau chief for The Economist. Everyone talked about it being a gamble. Sophie, is it a gamble that's paying off?
Not if you look at the polls at the moment, not at all. I mean, Macron's party is trailing in a distant third place, and the front runner at the moment, and that hasn't changed during this campaign, is that Marine Le Pen's far-right national rally. So, it looks extremely bad for Macron at this point, and I find it quite difficult to see how things could turn around. It is a second round of election, a two-round election, and it's important to bear that in mind, because it means he can, you can sort of have tactical arrangements between candidates after the first round, whereby one or other stands down in order to try and keep the far right out. But either way, some of his deputies, his outgoing deputies, are probably going to lose seats in the first round, and a lot of the others are going to be under a lot of pressure to stand down in order for those sort of tactical arrangements to be made after voting next week.
And as you say, the polls are pointing for a very poor performance by Macron's party and a very strong performance, perhaps even an outright majority for Marine Le Pen's party, the National Rally. Who are the main candidates to be Prime Minister?
Well, for Marine Le Pen's party, it's a 28-year-old called Jordan Bardella, who has been holding the presidency of the party for the last couple of years. He's very much a sort of protege of hers. He has worked his way up through politics. He's never held a job outside politics. He dropped out of university to go straight into politics and be a local councillor. He's her candidate, absolutely. She's clear about that. Gabriel Attal for Macron is the centrist candidate. He's the outgoing prime minister, currently still serving until there's a handover. And he is also very young. He's 35 years old. He's very much a sort of a mini-me almost of Macron, centrist, sort of young Parisian type of moderate from Macron's party. And then on the right, on the left, we have this left-wing alliance, which is an extraordinary sort of collection of parties that reaches from the sort of French equivalent of the Corbynist left to the moderate socialist, sort of more Blairite left, I suppose, is the way of thinking of it. And they can't agree on a candidate. So, I mean, we are completely unclear. That's why they've been putting up different candidates for the party in the debates we've been having. We had one on Tuesday and we've got another this evening. All
right, we were just looking at pictures there of Manuel Bompard, who may be one of their candidates. What would the implications be, Sophie, of a new government in France for the UK, given the ongoing debate over channel crossings and the fact that there will be a review of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement between the UK and the EU in a year's time?
Well, I think the main change would be if there really is a hard right, far right government under this guy Jordan Bardella. I mean, there is very little mention of this. You should know that. I mean, there's almost no mention of the UK at all in this election, nor of Brexit, nor of channel crossings or anything. But I think one can safely say that the far right party is going to do absolutely everything it can to make sure that it stops migrants coming into France and it gets rid of migrants as soon as they get here. So I should imagine that would be extremely complicated for the British government because they will not want camps on the northern French coast and they won't want to make that any easier for the UK. As for the renegotiations, I mean, the Marine Le Pen's party is just a sort of Eurosceptic party that doesn't quite use that term anymore, but it would also be a really difficult partner, I think, for the UK in any form of negotiations at EU level, even though those are supposed to take place at Brussels. The French view obviously counts for a lot in that. And there would be a complicated, tense relationship between a far-right Prime Minister and President Macron, who keeps his job. As you know, this isn't a presidential election. So I think it'd be difficult for the UK.
Sophie Pedder, thank you very much. Does it matter, the outcome of these elections?
I think it does, because it's not just France this is happening. I think there's a lurch to the right across Europe, and people are concerned about the same thing. They're concerned about migration, and that's so important that we deal with migration. And I think that's why our elections are so critical, because I believe we will, and I believe Labour will make things a lot worse. So does it matter? It does matter. We should recognise what's happening in France and make sure we don't end up in the same situation here.
Right. How much does it matter to the UK, the outcome of these elections?
Well, I believe every election matters. So clearly, the French election will matter. It'll matter to the continent of Europe, which is our biggest trading partner. In terms of our ability to tackle international security issues, it's a very big partner. So, of course, we'll be watching very closely. If there is a Labour government and the country chooses change next week, then, of course, we'll respect the views of the French people and their choice of government, and we'll find ways to work and cooperate. And that's the same is true for our other global partners.
Right.
Our interests are, paramount here, and tackling the issues which are global issues. We know that China is in competition for the way that we actually conduct ourselves as a group of nations. So we need to make sure that we find ways to strengthen these relationships with our national security and trade, and also the cultural links as well, and not let them fracture.
We only have a few seconds left. How important to you are these elections in France?
I think critical. I think the attitude to NATO as well, given the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. I think that's what Bardella has softened, actually, quite surprisingly, his attitude towards NATO.
Ava?
Hugely, because these are the fault lines that Reform are exploiting.
that Reform are exploiting. That's all we have time for. Thank you to all of our guests for joining me today. I'll be back with more Politics Live tomorrow, 12:15 on BBC Two and the iPlayer. Have a very good afternoon. Bye.
Calling all Glastonbury fans.
Get Worthy Farm ready.
With me, Annie.